Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a second. My name is Nancy Conover, and I'm the current chair of the Friends of the Wichita Art Museum, and we are just thrilled to have all of you with us. On their behalf, on the Friends' behalf, I welcome all of you. I don't want to take another minute, but to have Patricia McDonald come up here and introduce our fabulous speaker. Thank you again for coming.
It's always so wonderful to be introduced by someone from the Friends. Gosh, thank you for coming, everybody. I've been so looking forward to this presentation and welcoming such a distinguished curator to town for some time. And yet I want to start by acknowledging that this is an evening and program of the Friends of the Wichita Art Museum, really our very beloved volunteer group, without whom I think the whole building would fall down. I might. They give countless hours and lifeblood. Any number of these individuals have given decades and decades of service to the Art Museum. And many years ago, they raised funds to support the Howard Wooden Lecture Series so that we would be able to bring distinguished speakers this evening. And so Howard Wooden, former Wichita Art Museum director from 1975 to 1989, during the time that he was here, the Edward Larrabee Barnes expansion of the museum occurred. There was a strong development of the art collection as well. And from the many people that I've met in town who knew Howard, he was charming, beloved, and what a great way for the Friends then to recognize and honor an important leader of the arts and director of the Wichita Art Museum. So important to acknowledge the Friends and also recognize the man that made such a difference for the organization that they want to remember. So Elizabeth Mankin Kornhauser is our speaker this evening. She is the Alice Pratt Brown Curator of American Paintings and Sculpture at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And yet I know this distinguished speaker as Betsy. And she is all of our best friend at this point because one of the things that was a requirement that she came to Wichita with from her husband and son is she needed to take back Shocker t-shirts. So one of the activities that we had today was driving up to the university and going to the bookstore at the student center and, should it be this t-shirt or that t-shirt? And what do they have it? What sizes do they have it in? At any rate, she joined the Metropolitan staff in 2000, so relatively recent staff member there, and immediately went to work on reinstallation of their galleries for American art, and that really is the story that she'll be telling in her lecture this evening. She transitioned there. Previously, she spent 27 years at the Wadsworth Atheneum, incredible museum in Hartford, Connecticut. She started there as the chief curator, and then at a certain point promoted to deputy director. She was the acting director as different directors kind of came and went. Essentially, as I knew Betsy, over some of that period of time, she was running the place. Over her career, Betsy's organized a number of stunning shows of really major proportion. So, of course, the exhibition, but just rich scholarship that came with that, and an important publication that for a number of these shows really changed the landscape of what we know about that artist or that particular pocket of art history. Her PhD is from Boston University, and she worked on the artist Ralph Earl, who was an 18th century portraitist. So, of course, she did subsequent to the dissertation, she did an exhibition with scholarly publication on Earl that traveled the country. The Wadsworth Atheneum holds one of the country's supreme collections of Hudson River School paintings. She did 2 exhibitions over her years there, highlighting that collection. Of course, they also toured. I met Betsy a good number of years ago. She worked on the retrospective for the artist Marsden Hartley. I'm a Marsden Hartley specialist, so I made certain that we got together, and she brought me into that project. Very large show, really epic. She brought really the inner circle of Hartley people to be part of it with her, which is so generous, and also I think quite a smart way to do this. It was the first Marsden Hartley retrospective in about 25 years. It was a big success, toured nationally, helped to gain even more momentum of regard and scholarship on that particular artist. And so I've given you just a taste of the different projects that she's been involved with in the past. She's actually working on 3 exhibitions at the present that I wanted to share with you because it reflects the range of the different activities that she involves herself in, but also to let you know just sort of the stretch of her intellect. She's doing an exhibition titled Navigating the West, George Caleb Bingham and the River. She's doing an exhibition, John Singer Sargent's Portrait of the Arts, Artists, Writers, Actors, and Musicians. So these are the friends of this particular artist who very well regarded for many things, but in particular portraiture. And then, among his friends, whom did he elect to portray? And close to our heart here in the Midwest, Thomas Hart Benton's America Today murals. So, and yet, as I said at the start, Betsy is here to tell us the story of conceiving and then arraying and actually executing an all-new installation of galleries. And really, if you've not been to see them at the Metropolitan, it's acres and acres of galleries. How do you tell the story of American art in such an important world capital as New York? Well, that was Betsy's job, and her project opened to absolutely glowing reviews, and that doesn't happen all that often in the New York press. The New York Times critic Holland Cotter put it this way: how do the updated galleries look? Sensational. Help me to welcome Betsy Kornhauser to the stage.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm thrilled to reconnect with my wonderful friend and colleague, Patricia. And I have to say, you're very lucky to have her here in Wichita. She's a very major scholar. I certainly took advantage of her Marsden Hartley scholarship for my retrospective. And I so enjoyed seeing your collection of American paintings and sculpture. It was very impressive. I was snapping pictures all afternoon. And I felt like I've had the full Wichita experience because I did fly with the competing basketball team into Wichita, who could barely fit on this plane. And that's all I heard about on the flight. And I understand the game is tonight, so thank you so much for coming here. Really appreciate it. Well, I was handed this sort of dream job after years at a wonderful museum, the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art. It's a very historic museum, and so I was kind of rooted in the history of collecting American art in the 19th century. And when the Met approached me, it was a little intimidating. Many of the curators at the Met have been there for many years, and I had the impression that they believed that they were perfect, at the Met, and that, it was hard to expand on what had come before. So it was a little intimidating, but I think I was brought in because I am somewhat outspoken and love to change things around. And so I was given some leeway to do that with this great collection. And one of the things that I had in mind, and certainly my colleagues at the Met had in mind, was that in recent times, perhaps thanks to Mayor Bloomberg, New York City has become a tourist mecca, and The Met has perhaps the finest and most comprehensive collection of American art held by any museum, and we started to get a very large visitation of visitors from other countries. 45% of our visitors come from other countries. And this put a new spin on presenting American art to an audience, for me, in this particular project. How do you tell this story to people who have never seen American art before? So that was one of the goals. I also was aware that New York City was often the center for changes and new styles emerging over the course of the history of American painting. And finally, having spent many years in Hartford and, thinking of a museum like Wichita, when you come to a regional art museum, you want to see art from the region. And, in this case, it was the Hudson River Valley, New York City, New York State. So that was very much on my mind as well. In the years leading up to this project, I actually have only been at the Met 3 years. You gave me a few extra years. So I'm relatively new, and I had to move pretty quickly, assess the collections. And I was inspired by the fact that in the last 5 years, there's been this kind of great celebration and advancement of American art. There have been many new museums built, new wings. The Boston Museum's Art of the Americas wing was very influential, and I quickly picked up on the fact that they were competitors for us at the Met. But we were very mindful of the fact that they defined American art more broadly, presenting art of all of the Americas, including Latin America, Canada, some Native American arts, which was a very interesting new take. I was also deeply inspired by my years at the Wadsworth Atheneum, which is the oldest public art museum in the United States. It opened in 1844. There is the founder, Daniel Wadsworth, who was one of the great patrons of American art at the time. He was, the leading patron for Thomas Cole. He discovered Frederick Church. He really brought the Hudson River School artists, allowed them to advance by his major commissions. And when the museum opened, it opened with contemporary American art, which were these paintings that he commissioned of Thomas Cole. And of course, this great national school, which reigned for most of the 19th century, defined a new subject, which became the sort of national obsession in the United States in the 19th century, which was its wilderness landscape and the settlement of the land across the 19th century, moving westward. So here we have this great early Thomas Cole view of Catterskill Falls and the Catskills, celebrating the vast wilderness lands, the symbol of the Native American as a witness to God's pure wilderness. There was this wonderful spiritual overtone. He frequently visited Daniel Wadsworth's country estate, which was built in 1810 in the wilderness on top of a mountain, and was sort of a model in Cole's mind for living within wilderness nature and communing with nature. It became a symbol of the power and possibilities that the new world, this new nation, offered and had in front of it, this vast wilderness landscape. And as I said, it was also a place for spiritual contemplation. He painted, he communed, Thomas Cole, with the great writers of the day, all based in New York City. The Last of the Mohegans was a painting that he took from James Fenimore Cooper's very popular novel, published just the year before. Everyone had read it by 1827. And interestingly puts in this painting the sort of psychosexual passages that are quite racy in Cooper's novel, showing this phallic pinnacle with the evil warrior Magua, and then these women fighting for their virtue in front of the dark cave. So these were very progressive works that hung in the Wadsworth Atheneum. And then, of course, Frederick Church was discovered in Hartford and set out to become probably the most famous of the Hudson River School painters, painting this Founding of Hartford work that was commissioned for the Wadsworth Atheneum. And then finally, by the mid-century after Wadsworth's death, Samuel Colt, the great arms manufacturer, and his wife, Elizabeth Hart Jarvis Colt, put together one of the greatest private picture galleries in the United States in their home Armsmere in Hartford. So commissioned this great Frederick Church masterpiece of Jamaica, which had overtones painted during the Civil War era. And you can see the private picture gallery here with Elizabeth Colt in her large portrait. And finally, the collection added these later so-called luminist style late Hudson River School landscape paintings that painted after the Civil War in this more poetic manner. So I was, deeply schooled in this national school. I was also struck by the fact that new American museums emerged in the last few years. Alice Walton became, someone that we greatly admired, who constructed and built this great new Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas. It took a while for all of us to digest this fact, and how did this happen? But she's the most charming woman, and sort of, you can't not like her. And so this opened, with all kinds of excitement around it. But there were moments of tension about, in the field of American art, New York really does think they're the center of the world. And this great icon, this Asher B. Duran painting called Kindred Spirits, which hung in New York. You can see these wonderful large galleries that she created with really the full story of American art in a smaller form. But she did steal this painting from New York City. It had always hung in the public library, and the Met and the National Gallery tried to team up and prevent this sale from happening, and they just didn't move fast enough. And it was sort of a wake-up call. Alice really meant business, and she got this painting, and it forced everyone to start to think about, where should American art be presented? And we've all come to the conclusion that, of course, it should be everywhere across the United States and beyond. Our goals certainly now are to bring American art to the larger world. But having this great museum in Bentonville has proven to be a wonderful new addition to the field, and all was forgiven, and we collaborate now and have joint programs. So it was a great success. Here you see, this was really a memorial to Thomas Cole. He's standing in his beloved Catskills, looking at Catterskill Cove with his favorite friend, the nature poet William Cullen Bryant, really defining this great subject as the subject for American artists in the 19th century. So that brings me to my great challenge. I was brought to the Met, as an outsider, coming in after my colleagues had spent a decade raising money and rebuilding from the inside out these wonderful new American galleries, 26 new galleries. And I had the fun of coming in and hanging them, as they kept reminding me. And I think the really goal was for me to introduce some fresh new ideas. And it was interesting to delve into the history of the Met. The American Wing, we call ourselves the Northwest Frontier. This is where we are. Fifth Avenue is out here. You enter the Met here. And the modern and contemporary galleries are down on the south end. And I point that out because it will be a topic I'll return to. But this is a 4-block area. So you can see how vast it is. We are built into Central Park in the American Wing spaces. But the Met didn't start out with a collection of American art early on. It was really founded in the aftermath of the Civil War, and this is an important point, and I'll return to that as well. It was established in 1870. In its early years, it was housed in a townhouse on 14th Street, which you see here. And this painting by the American artist Frank Waller shows the second floor galleries. But by 1880, the Met that we know today was built, and It didn't start out with an American collection, even though many of the early trustees were members of the Hudson River School, interestingly. Frederick Church, John Frederick Kensett, Sanford Gifford, they were all early trustees. William Cullen Bryant, who we saw on the screen a minute ago, were founding members. But it started out more in the arena of decorative arts and architecture. One of the early presidents of the Met, Robert DeForest, gave a gift to found what was called the American Wing. I mean, it is an archaic term in our current time to be called an American Wing, but we'll certainly retain that because it has such an early history. But it was kind of apart from the rest of the museum. And the Met always likes to do things in a very big way. So in order to introduce visitors to their arrival point to the American Wing, they moved the 1824 old branch bank of the United States facade, which was languishing in lower Manhattan, moved it up, and it became the entrance to the American Wing, which housed American decorative arts and architecture. The American painting collection was slower to kind of gel, even though paintings were being given. I discovered they were housed in the European painting department, cared for by European curators until 1945, which is pretty shocking. So the focus was on decorative arts and architecture, and there were some groundbreaking exhibitions, the Hudson Fulton exhibition of 1909, which celebrated Robert Fulton's invention of the steamboat, and it was sort of in the midst of this growing fascination with America's early colonial history, the colonial revival period, and so we begin to see these galleries of early American furniture. Here's, this sort of lineup of furniture, which was on view early on. And later on, in order to make the American Wing physically part of the rest of the Met, this beautiful Engelhart Court was built in the 1970s, and it was intended to house the great sculpture collection. And so that was kind of what we were dealing with in the 1980s, when it was decided that it was time for American art to come of age. And the head of the American Wing, Maury Heckscher, who's still there, developed this it was really almost a 20-year plan in 3 phases to bring American art to the fore. And it began with, changing Engelhart Court into a more formal gallery for monumental sculpture. Augustus St. Gaudens' Diana, you see, being moved in. So the celebration of monumental, large pieces of sculpture, and this is a view of it after the renovation. They also managed to put in galleries of glass and silver and decorative arts on these upper enfilade galleries, looking out at Central Park, where there's great histories of American ceramics and glass. And it's also housing the largest collection of American stained glass, I think held by any museum. Here you see the great Louis Comfort Tiffany window autumn landscape, which is embedded in this Engelhart Court. Frank Lloyd Wright's great windows from the Avery Conley house. And so that was, our second phase. And then the period rooms, the Met early on really focused on presenting American art through period rooms that they would remove from historic houses up and down the East Coast and beyond, beginning in the early 20th century. And we now have over 20 of these furnished rooms. And those were totally renovated, put in chronological order, and new computer programs put into these galleries. Here is the great meeting house, Hingham, Massachusetts, 1681. The Alexandria Ballroom, this wonderful 18th century room. There were galleries that presented styles that you can see, the neoclassical style in American decorative arts and painting. A Shaker retiring room from New Lebanon, New York. this wonderful Gothic library from the Hudson River Valley, Newburgh, New York, all the way through to Frank Lloyd Wright's room from Wayzata, Minnesota, where we sort of end in time. So this was another phase, and finally, I was able to transform these old galleries that were really not particularly, I don't know how many of you visited the Met in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, but this is what you would have seen. It wasn't really a comprehensive story of American art. It was these sort of double and triple salon-style hangs that were not the best way to view American paintings. The lighting was not very good. But this is, here you have these masterpieces, by Winslow Homer and John Singer Sargent on these, literally on these panels. So this was the final phase that I was brought in with, other colleagues to mastermind and transform this great collection. So we worked with a wonderful architect, Kevin Roach, with our designers at the Met, and spent, at least a year just brainstorming the storylines we wanted to tell. The architects had created very beautiful galleries that were a sort of Beaux-Arts style, very traditional. We were anxious that our galleries wouldn't appear dated 10 years from now, and we don't think they're going to. We had beautiful skylights put in, oak floors. You'll see limestone trim, very beautiful classic galleries with a wonderful hanging system. And we laid out 26 galleries and then spent literally a year just playing in our design department, moving things around, reassessing. I would occasionally ask, what's great about the Met is you can go ask your European painting colleague to come over and take a look and see what they think. And so it was really on computers that we were working. We could access the paintings, we could see them, but you had to sort of play this game of moving them around with the storylines that you wanted to tell. And one of the great advances our new director put into play was that he wanted every curator to develop a theme for their gallery, so that when you walked in, you would see a thematic label. Oh, this is what this gallery is about. So we developed this desire to tell the history of American painting and sculpture, and then to embed the galleries with specific themes that made sense, and then try to tell the international, national, and regional stories as you go through. And again, it is based on the strengths of our collections. There were certainly areas of weakness that I identified as a newcomer that I thought needed help. I remember taking the wonderful writer David McCullough, the historian David McCullough, through midway through. And he was dazzled by our plan and our layout. And he said, Betsy, you're going to really get in trouble. There are no depictions of Native Americans. Like, where are they? So I had to run out. I ran out up and down Park Avenue, Fifth Avenue to our Bryant Fellows, or our great support system, into their apartments, just taking paintings off their walls, when I found a great Western work. Because our Western art collection, I think the Met thought, oh, we don't need to collect Western art. Well, yes, you do need to collect Western art. Of course you do. So we remedied that to some extent. We need to add more works by women artists, by African-American artists. We still have a ways to go. And as a new person, I could feel confident, even though, it was a little scary, but I had to say it. These things are missing, and we need to do what we can before we open, and then make it our mission to continue to pursue, to broaden our definition of American art. So we did these, grand layouts, and of course, we're going to talk about that huge painting on the screen there. This was our team when we finally opened. And so I'm now going to just take you through the galleries, showing you the themes just very quickly so you get a sense of how comprehensive we could be. We began with introducing, the first form of painting, Colonial Portraits. We could show a broad range of, John Singleton Copley and Joseph Blackburn here, the Boston artists, and William Badger, who was more of a provincial painter, painting in this charming style. But had this great iconic work by the American artist Matthew Pratt, which shows this sort of trend of American artists going to London in the latter part of the 18th century, particularly during the war years, to be greeted by their colleague Benjamin West, who had established himself in London and became a leading artistic figure in that city. And he welcomed all of the American artists into his studio. Here you see him instructing these young American painters in his London studio in the art of draftsmanship, something that they could not learn in the American colonies. And then William Pratt has separated himself out as a full-fledged painter already, practicing his art. But I then got it in my head, being influenced by the Boston Museum and some of the other newly opened American art wings and installations, that I would just borrow a great Latin American painting. This is a great Peruvian portrait painted in 1770. I didn't really tell anyone I was doing it because I was afraid at the Met it can be very bureaucratic, and I just took a risk, borrowed it from collectors that I knew as a contrast to the American colonial painters, Copley, Blackburn, Smibert, who, we know they were very successful, dazzling painters, but it was important to remind our visitors that to the south of us, there were far more sophisticated artistic centers. And here you have this leading Peruvian artist, Cristobal Lozano, painting this very aristocratic woman, Peruvian woman, just before her marriage. And the iconography, it's largely European fashion statements, but she has this little yellow flower in her hair, which was a Peruvian national symbol. Also proud of her region. And I just put it in the center of the gallery, and it became this catalyst. And just recently, a year ago, our director hired a curator of Latin American art for the American wing, and we are now beginning to explore that area, which the Met had really neglected up until this time. So change is possible. I did celebrate Copley with his own gallery because he's such an amazing artist. And of course, the Met loves these large architectural pieces. This is a Benjamin Rush carving from Philadelphia. And here's this great, showing Copley with a Hudson River Valley painting, rather, to highlight the year he spent in New York painting the family, the Verplanck family, and this great portrait of this young boy with his pet squirrel, which is a wonderful work. We also included a 17th and 18th century silver gallery in the mix of our paintings. And this great Van Rensselaer parlor from the Hudson Valley, again, the Albany area, shows how some of the colonists, the most elite, wealthy colonists, rather than collecting old master paintings, they imported this French wallpaper of classical scenes, which is fascinating. The Era of the Revolution is a major gallery where we display these full-length portraits of the heroes of that time, as well as history paintings by John Trumbull, which you see here, and of course portraits of George Washington as our great leader during the Revolutionary War. And I particularly love this work by Charles Wilson Peale because he had fought under Washington and was a very close friend of Washington's. And there's this sort of informality about this painting and a confidence that he conveys in this work. We also have a great collection of watercolor miniature portraits by American artists. This was a favorite, more personal form of portraiture where artists worked in watercolor on ivory. And we have this miniature box so that you can try to really understand how this very delicate art form was done with tiny brushes, watercolor on these thin slices of ivory. And many of the leading artists, the Peale family in particular, did both large scale oils and these tiny miniatures. And there's a subcategory that has become very popular at the Met, these very personal depictions. They're called eye miniatures. Edward Malbone was a leading New York miniaturist, and they were often paintings of your lover. Sometimes you didn't want the person to know who that was. And so they were, hidden objects that were very personal. And one of the most celebrated tiny, tiny objects in our collection, it's in the miniature gallery, which I'll just go back to for a minute. It's right in here, is a portrait done by a leading Boston miniaturist, Sarah Goodrich, who had a relationship with Daniel Webster during her lifetime and painted this. It was called Beauty Revealed just for Daniel Webster. It was in a case, it had a lid and he could close it up. It descended in his family. And it's one of the most extraordinary objects. It's been written about by many, many major art historians and writers. And it's a fascinating object because she's clearly in control of this relationship. And absolutely intrigues our visitors. I can't show it all the time because these objects are so fragile. They're light sensitive. So this is only out on rare occasions, but it is of great fascination to our visitors, even though it's tiny. This wonderful gallery of the spread of portraiture during the federal period after the war, where a new form of democratic portraiture emerges. And this is the great Ralph Earl portrait of a small town Connecticut merchant who's imported all these great fabrics. He's dressed in the latest fashion, English style, leaning on his work desk. This is a portrait you'd never find in England. He's at work at his desk, and he's basically advertising his goods. He's saying, come to my shop and buy these beautiful chintz fabrics, and you can look like me. And it's just this great American entrepreneurial statement painted in 1789, and really speaks to the direction the nation was heading. We have this wonderful gallery of early 19th century portraits when our American artists were, here we have Thomas Sully painting the Ascension of Queen Victoria in the early 19th century. And I particularly wanted to focus on American folk art, which is a favorite area of mine. And the Met had not really kind of put this part of the collection front and center. So we did this great gallery of mainly 19th century folk art by itinerant portrait painters, carvers, some of the great works in the collection. This Ami Phillips, he was a traveling portrait painter working in New York State and New England, who developed this brilliant formula which he could execute very quickly because he would travel from town to town, but it was so brilliant and so successful, where he captures in this sort of flat, boldly colored forms the essence of this mother and child portrait, and today is considered a great masterpiece. The other favorite work, we did borrow a few objects from the Museum of American Folk Art in New York. This great phrenological head of a young girl carved by Asa Ames. Phrenology was this pseudoscience highly embraced in the 19th century where a person's skull would be examined to convey their character. And I actually think it affected the ways in which these portraits were presented. These likenesses and the sort of spiritual quality of the sitter was of great importance. American genre painting has a whole gallery filled with these wonderful portraits, often having embedded political statements or wonderful ways of conveying life in America before the Civil War. This work will be the subject of our George Caleb Bingham River Painting series. And at the Met, we have a large painting conservation department. And I was able to work with our painting conservator, who specializes in American art, to discover that the artist had done a lot of underdrawing. He had a large bear here, a little bear cub here. He was going to include a mast and a sail with a flag flying off, lots of trees, and brilliantly decides to pare it all down. And so we've written this essay indicating how brilliantly this virtually untutored artist working in Missouri just figured this out, and it's become one of the great icons of American art. It's considered one of the greatest American paintings ever painted, and a lot of it had to do with the fact that he he was sort of unfettered by worrying about European artistic traditions. He was responding to what was around him. He grew up right on the Missouri River, and it was just this brilliant execution. And so we deconstructed it in the conservation studio and have, so you should come and see this show in the summer of 2015 if you can. And then, of course, I went crazy with the Hudson River School, taking over 3 galleries to tell this great national story of the Hudson River School based in New York, but of course they travel all over, to New World sites. And we begin, of course, with Thomas Cole in this early gallery with his great painting, The Oxbow of the Connecticut River, where he lays out his arguments for this rapid settlement of the land, where he bifurcates the landscape with wilderness here, settled land here, and he places himself in the center and basically conveying this message that things were moving very quickly. He wasn't necessarily happy about it. He places himself on the wilderness side where he felt more comfortable, and here's the cultivated landscape beyond. And there's this detail of his own self-portrait. He turns toward you, places the brush near his head to indicate to you that this is a painting about ideas, nothing to do with topography or something that simple. And it's just another great masterpiece. He would later do this wonderful view of the Catskill Valley near his studio, just before the railroad was put in. In fact, the construction had begun, and he was very upset about it and wanted to capture this great and favorite view before the train started destroying it for him. And then his great followers, Asher B. Durand, painting, the woods as a cathedral. We didn't have great ruins in the United States, but we had beautiful wilderness lands where you could commune with God in this kind of cathedral-like setting. And then our large central gallery, the elephant in the room. I was very proud of my colleagues. Before I was hired, they decided to commit 100% to this massive painting by Emanuel Leutze, this history painting painted in the 1840s of Washington crossing the Delaware. And all of you have seen this on calendars, and it's been spoofed and jokes have been made about it. But they decided to take it seriously, and it had a long history at the Met. It arrived in the late 19th century, didn't have a frame on it. It was dirty, and over the course of the 20th century, I think there were moments where the museum just wanted it to disappear, and they actually shipped it out to this historic museum in Trenton, and didn't want to bother with it. But my colleagues decided to commit to a major conservation treatment and the recreation of its original frame. And the history of it is fascinating. I had mentioned that the Met was founded in the aftermath of the Civil War, and in many respects, possibly as a result of this great event that took place in New York called the Metropolitan Sanitary Fair. Abraham Lincoln founded the Sanitary Fair Commission to aid Union Army soldiers during the Civil War, and the way they raised money, and it was all women doing the hard work, organized these fairs in the major cities, Chicago, Philadelphia, Brooklyn, and New York's was the biggest. And the art community in New York held an art gallery. The major artists, them, Church, Kensett, Gifford, and Emanuel Leutze hung this great gallery of art, both by American and European artists. There were 350 works presented, and on the far wall was the great Emanuel Leutze in the center. To the left was Albert Bierstadt's great Rocky Mountain Landers Peak, and to the right was Frederick Church's great masterpiece, Heart of the Andes. Over that hung the portraits of the 3 presidents, and over the Bierstadt an early Thomas Cole painting. And they were the anchors, and they were intended to sort of evoke the North and the South, with the Leutze in the center as this great patriotic work that reminded visitors of how their nation was founded and the heroic efforts of the American colonists to fight and win the war, because of course, in this painting by Loitza, it is one of the most important moments, turning points of the Revolutionary War, where you have Washington in this rowboat. Loitza really exaggerated this whole event. On Christmas Eve night, 1776, they surprised the Hessian soldiers in Trenton, New Jersey, and it was the turning point of the war. So to bring this painting back to an audience during the Civil War was a really profoundly successful event, and it really did stir patriotism. Here we have this great Matthew Brady photograph of how it looked, and you can see the original frame. This was the only view we had of that frame, and here's a detail of it with this great eagle scroll on top, all this symbolism that had to do with Washington's successful military career. You can see this was the most elaborate aspect of the frame on the top. Here you see, excuse me, in the early 20th century, the painting hung in the Met in this small little frame, and it had this very long history. It sort of was taken up, taken down, where is it going to go? And finally, as I said, my colleagues decided to reproduce the frame completely. Eli Wilner and Company spent a year. And here you can see a comparison of their work against the original. And here we are installing it in the gallery and surrounding it, with, we'll see it in a minute, in the great frame. And then to the right hung this great Frederick Church, Heart of the Andes, in a period frame. And we had to, with these great presidential portraits above, this was a very patriotic installation. Here's the painting itself, showing, the southern realms of America. And we had to acquire a period frame designed by Church for that work in order to really make it come to life. We include now in the gallery his breathtaking oil studies that he did for these paintings. And across the way, his great competitor, Albert Bierstadt, who was the great artist of the American West, his painting hung in the Sanitary Fair on the opposite side, Rocky Mountain Landers Peak. And here you see this great work where Bierstadt studied the Sioux Indian tribe on his first expedition out with Colonel Lander. And he would later honor Lander, who died early on in the Civil War in the first year, by naming the painting after him. So these are all, very powerful works during the Civil War. They all come into the Met's collection, and the Met, only 3 years later, the same group of men who organized and hung the Sanitary Fair Gallery formed the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So this direct connection, I think, is beautifully laid out in our current gallery in this space. And finally, we end with the late Hudson River School artists who move after the war into this much more poetic, transcendental interpretation of nature. And you can see how poetic and personal these works are. Martin Johnson Head's The Coming Storm, just before the Civil War. Sanford Gifford's Catterskill Clove, painted while he was serving in the Union Army and returned to his beloved Catskill region, paints this meditative, contemplative view of nature as a kind of soothing work during the war years, the way you could commune with nature during very stressful times. And then John Kensett's very minimal, extremely radical, pared down view of Long Island Sound. Because of the connection to the Civil War, the Met has one of the greatest collections of Civil War era paintings, and Winslow Homer is our star. We have so many spectacular works by Winslow Homer, and this being one of the major ones, Prisoners from the Front, where you see this Union Army soldier confronting, this sort of ragtag group of Confederate soldiers, young and old, and you can just see the exhaustion from this horrific horrific war embedded in that work. And we also, have our gallery filled with this great standing Lincoln sculpture, views of freed slaves, Homer's great depiction of the Carnival, African Americans in their regional attire dancing. A lot of American artists turn their attention to depicting African Americans in the aftermath of the war years. And then we have a gallery devoted to Winslow Homer and Thomas Eakins. We have these great views of Pratt's Neck, Maine, that Homer painted from his studio, which is now open to the public on the coast of Maine. And Eakins' great, the Champion Single Skulls, where you see his self-portrait here, a great masterpiece. We chose to show depictions in one of our galleries of artists in their studios. By the latter part of the 19th century, American artists were traveling to Europe in great numbers and were becoming more self-important and depicting themselves in their studios. Augustus St. Gaudens is here in his studio, and we have, of course, a very large collection of his sculpture. Our collection of American Western art is weak, I have to say, and it's a goal for us to improve that. But we have a particularly strong collection of Western bronzes, and we'll be opening an exhibition next month on masterpieces of Western bronze art by leading artists and some artists that are not as well known. But we do dedicate this space to the theme of the myth of the West, essentially. And then our artists traveling around the world, the cosmopolitan spirit, where you begin to see Whistler and Sargent and other American artists interacting as expatriates in Europe. Our American Impressionist galleries are very extensive. William Merritt Chase's At the Seaside on Long Island is a beautiful example of the Impressionist style of the late 19th century. There's a gallery devoted to sort of honoring the fact that American women artists come of age during this time, Mary Cassatt, Cecilia Beau, and not only are they accepted as professional artists in France, in Paris, but their subject matter focuses on women as well. And their male colleagues also focus on women in the late 19th century, this great Alexander White. And then, of course, we have our walls of Mary Cassatt at this time. And then portraiture in the grand manner, our collection, this was a sort of revival in the late 19th century of society portraiture. John Singer Sargent is perhaps the best known. We have the very famous Madame X. We've always tried to decide what the most famous painting in the collection is. And we think it's probably this work, Madame X. Maybe Leutz's Washington Crossing the Delaware. We're still open to discuss that. But this gallery is filled with these grand scale works by Sargent, with the great St. Gaudens sculpture in the center. And here, of course, is our Madame X. And we'll, as Patricia mentioned, we'll be delving into another aspect of Sargent's art at the Met in a major exhibition on more personal portraits of his friends, his closest friends. And finally, we end with the Ashcan School, the School of American Realists that leave Philadelphia. Many of them start their careers as newspaper illustrators and come to New York and paint the darker, rougher side of urban life. This is a more cheerful work by William Glatkins of Central Park, but they take the subject of democratic spaces where people can gather and find entertainment. And this is the last image I'll show you, but I did want to end my talk by telling you what is going to change in the next year. After we opened this, and it was very well received, the one thing that bothered me the most when I arrived at the Met was that there was this strange cutoff for American art. And it really had nothing to do with any rational reason for it. It was simply that the American wing was on the northwestern end of the Met, and the modern and contemporary department was on the south end of the Met. And so American modernism found its way to the south end. And I found this unacceptable, and I was very outspoken about it. And I've managed to place a young curator from Kansas. He was born and raised in Kansas, and is a expert in the field of American modernism. Randy Griffey is now our new associate curator on the south end. And he and I are planning all kinds of change. I'm going to give him some of our late 19th century paintings to hang in his modern galleries, and he's going to ship me over some works by Grant Wood's, The Ride of Paul Revere, and Marston Hartley's portrait of Albert Pinkham Ryder. I have my wish list, and he has his. So the next time, I would say by late spring, when you come to the Met, you will see this kind of wonderful merging of the story of American art that will take you through Georgia O'Keeffe and hopefully Edward Hopper, depending how generous Randy wants to be. And it will be a much more extensive story, and then we will send you down to the south end of our huge museum to pick that story up and take you through to contemporary time. So thank you very much, and I hope all of you come to see our relatively new galleries and to enjoy them. Thank you. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take a few, if you have questions. Yes?
We all know the iconic Washington crossing the Delaware, and I've always wondered if Looksy ever painted any other significant paintings.
Yes, he actually painted a whole series of history paintings that chronicled the history of the founding of America. So he started with, Columbus, and the Wadsworth Athenaeum owns a work called The Storming of the Teocalli, which was the history of Mexico and the fall of the Aztecs. So he did a whole series, and the crowning work was this Washington crossing the Delaware. And what I didn't say was that he painted that in Germany in the 1840s, initially to inspire the Germans, who were in a moment of revolution themselves, to take an example from the United States and from great leaders like Washington to form a democracy. And then he, shipped it over to the United States, where it becomes a vehicle for renewing patriotic fervor during the Civil War. Yeah. Yes?
Is Thomas Hart Benton in...
Oh, that's on the south end, but the good news is that we were just given the great New School America Today mural, and Randy and I are co-curating its installation in the American Wing. So this is all happening in very recent time, and it's a fabulous mural. It's Benton at his most radical and socially liberal, and it was probably because Jackson Pollock was his student at the time, and Pollock served as a model for a number of the figures in this mural. So we're going to deconstruct it with an app that you can download on your iPhone. And that's opening this coming September, so don't miss that. Yeah. Yes?
I assume much of this is accessible on the web.
It is, yeah.
We have a website that's...
We do, and you can access our collection on the web.
The silver is on there too.
I can't promise you that, because that's a huge collection.
I
Some of it will be there, but probably not all of it. But there's a brand new collection catalog that was just published on our silver collection. It just came out 2 months ago.
just the silver.
Only the silver. Only the Met would do that. I don't think any other museum could afford to do that. We actually have a curator of 18th century American silver. It's crazy.
How many pieces have you?
Oh, there are thousands.
Wow.
Yeah, because they go into the early 20th century. So volume 1 is out on the 18th century, and they're now working on volume 2 on the 19th century. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
I think one of the joys would be is the storytelling part of your job, and especially for the area you're in and educating people, and that feels refreshing, what you learned in college and what you're able to do to expand on that. But it almost seems like at times it would be frustrating too, because there's so many stories to
I
tell.
know.
You can loan out to museums or borrow and bring in, but your time is sort of limited. How do you balance?
Well, we have a very large education department who, they partner with us. It's a huge department. And we have highly trained docents. So I'm not the only one who tells these stories, but we do have audio tours, and we have fellows and interns. It's a very big department. And so there are always tour guides in the galleries. And the curator tries to convey the storyline, then share it with the education department, and then, whoops, it filters down. But you're right. I mean, I think the opportunities to interact with the public for a curator are very exciting, but we can't do as much as we would like to do. But there are occasional high moments where I worked with high school students who were studying at the film, it's a graduate program in filmmaking, but they take high school students, and they did films on the Emanuel Leutze, and they interviewed the public and, heard everything from, I hate this painting, to, this is a joke, to, veterans crying in front of the painting, or someone from Germany just in awe. It was incredible, and they created films that were their own. And so you have these great opportunities, but it is a little overwhelming. But my instinct is to keep expanding the story, not shrinking the story. So our new curator of Latin American art will have a presence soon in the galleries. Yes?
Is there still a gallery that weds the early American furniture with paintings?
Yes, we have those galleries. I showed a few of them where they're style galleries, the federal period, and we hang paintings and decorative arts in those spaces. And the other big accomplishment was that we have the loose study storage, which we upgraded. So all of our collection is on view. We don't have anything that's not on view. So you can go to that area. It's a little overwhelming, but there are computers where you can, get the, basic data on what you're looking at. Yes?
Where does the money come from?
Well, as Patricia knows, curators, we are really good fundraisers. It's not just the development department. And so we're out there constantly fundraising. But, the best way to raise money is to create these beautiful new galleries and say, this can be, your space for your... But we're out there all the time. And, it's I have to say, a little easier to raise money at the Met because it's such a show place. We get 6.4 million visitors a year through the Met. And so, that is just very enticing. But certain collectors would prefer not to give to the Met because they feel like they would just be a tiny little speck in this huge... But the money just comes in. It's, New York is a center, and it comes from all different sources, but mainly individuals. Almost, the major money we get are from individuals. And in my area of American art, there's a lot of, patriotism and, and there are certain people that want us to expand agendas and storylines that we need to, and they're willing to help us with that. Yeah. So it does come in.
Betsy, can you talk for just a second about the physical space of the galleries? Very much a manner of the Grand Gallery and, tremendously tall ceilings. Was that a given from the beginning? Did you have a conversation with sort of the team about we could reshape some spaces differently, or?
Yeah, I think it was a sort of a contrast between wanting spaces, as I said earlier, that would not seem dated. There's such a danger of tapping into the latest fad, and then like 5 years later, you're going, oh my God, that is so 2010, and you have to start over again. So we went for classic, how do paintings look best? They've always looked best with skylights, natural light, a combination of natural light and great, interior lights, with architecture that doesn't compete with the paintings, with a hanging system that allows you to change your, the hang with tall classic ceilings. But another program for our galleries was that we could change them very, very easily. So that, it's not a problem at all if I want to, as I'm about to do, rehang all those late galleries with more modern paintings. That's not going to be a problem. And I feel like if you look at some of the newer building programs, they didn't think about that, and they're kind of locked in to one way to see these galleries, and only one way, and they can't change it without rebuilding their gallery spaces. So we like the combination of the classic painting gallery, which gives you the ideal conditions to look at the paintings, but we can change them very, very easily. So that was the thinking. The Met has never been about, as much as I love contemporary architecture, and I do, the Met has never been about that. Yeah. It's always more classic. We're about to take over the Breuer building, which will be exciting. Yeah. The Whitney building. So any other questions? Yes.
When you have a lot of depth with a particular painter, like you were talking about the Homers, how do you select? I always wonder when I'm looking at one, and I know you have 25 more in the vault. I want to see them all. How do they rotate through? Will those rotate through?
We change them a lot. We lend a lot too. We lend, to exhibitions around the world all the time. But then if you have a particularly rich area like we do with John Singer Sargent or Homer, then I think the curator's job is to do a focused loan show on that artist so you can really showcase your own collection in a larger way. But Homer's tough because we have so many. We have them spread across 4 galleries. Oh, gee. Well, we have, what I didn't really show you tonight is our works on paper collection, which is huge. And we, try to show that, but that is light sensitive. So of the oil paintings, I would say we probably do have about 20 Winslow Homers. And yeah, it's amazing. Yeah. So, yes.
Back to the fundraising. Do you have any support groups, volunteer groups who work with you?
Oh, yes.
And also do fundraising?
We have layers of them. We have our Bryant Fellows. You saw him on the screen. And they are our highest level. And what's wonderful about them, but I was trading notes with your funders group last night, and it's very similar. It's just on a larger scale. They work amongst themselves so that they kind of ask each other. It's a very nice system. And you're expected to be a generous contributor. Then we have a very large friends group. It's a huge, huge group. And, they're great supporters and friends. And then there's a massive development department. And the Met, it's competitive to be involved in the Met. So you enter one of these groups with the understanding that, there are expectations. It's very different from Hartford, where I came from. Yeah. But it is a big part of what we do. But what we try to do is to do excellent programs, great galleries, great exhibitions that really inspire our donors. Yeah. Yes?
Should museums with extensive depths or in either genres or artists consider extended reciprocal loans?
Oh, sure. We are sharing a painting right now with Crystal Bridges. Credit Suisse gave us 50% and Crystal Bridges 50% of a great John Trumbull full-length portrait of Alexander Hamilton. He's a great New York hero. And so this is a nice solution. We ship it back and forth depending on what our conservators say we can do. But it's like every 3 or 4 years. But yeah, we are now showing works from the Museum of American Folk Art because they had to sell their building and they're homeless right now. So, we're trying to give them a presence. And there's a lot of trading and I think it is a really smart way to, as things become more expensive, our contemporary department at the Met is co-buying with other museums because the art is so expensive. Yeah. So it's a smart plan, yeah.
Anything here you'd like to?
Oh, I actually took quite a few pictures of things I would snatch right away from you if I could, yeah. There are many things up in those galleries. I would. Whoa, trading is an option, yeah. Trading is an option, certainly. Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.